Thanks for inviting me, Hilary. Lovely to be here. I grew up in that other great, was born in that other great city of culture, Liverpool, across the Pennines. And I grew up not very far away from that other great rugby league playing town, St Helens, if I can mention that in all, Kingston Rovers ground. I now live between the two. And here, I'm trying to very briefly give you an overview from the global to the local and the context in which I see this happening. Thanks, Dave. Yes, there is a global problem, as the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organisation recognised opening the Committee on World Food Security a couple of years ago, that our current food systems don't deliver healthy diets to people globally, not just in the UK. As Hilary mentioned, and as Tim Benton said in our evidence session actually, the current food systems we've got aren't fit for purpose in the 21st century, and business as usual isn't an option. That's because of the ecological issues with it. You know, the biggest thing you can do to change greenhouse gas emissions is not change your car, but your diet. And the system we have now is a bit like the banking system before the crisis 10 years ago. And resilience is not something we have to think about locally, but something we have to think about globally, and how those two connect. And one of the things that's driven the direction of dietary change is the level of advertising, which, if any of you saw the You Firmly Witnessed things recently, he focused on a bit. But just to give you a picture globally, McDonald's and Coke each spent more than the entire budget of the World Health Organization per year in the mid-2000s. It's probably got worse, that's the latest figures. And that is just staggering. And then that's just two companies. And today marketing is not simply about adverts. It's about product placement. It's about texting. It's about the stuff that goes on in the apps that you see for your children today. And if you look in Britain at the level of advertising for what we ought to think of as a healthy diet and what we actually get promoted, it's a completely inverse relationship. Most of it goes onto fatty and sugary foods. A tiny, tiny amount goes in. And a couple of years ago, was it last year, the Food Foundation, next slide, produced a very interesting report about how, in effect, we're kind of force-fed and we're led into a kind of consumption pattern, which is not healthy either for us or for our planet and our future. So there's a lot of big forces going on that shape what we do. And when I wrote the book on the food system with my colleague Tony Worsley over 20 odd years ago, it struck me there are four big words to think about in what's going on in our food system. Who has what power to control their bit of the action? Who carries the risks from what they're doing? And who gets the benefits? And that's the kind of words you need to think about when you're looking about the kind of changes that are being introduced. And it goes for the economics. If we've got an economics that delivers a lot of benefits, but they go to very few, then that is a problem. Next slide. Now, in our food systems, there are various different actors, and I gather many of these are represented in this room. There are the input suppliers, the energy, the seas, the fertilizer companies that supply the farmers. You've got traders, the people who move the foodstuffs around the world, which, as a port in Hull and certainly in Liverpool, you saw in a big way. You've got the workers. The food sector is the biggest employer in the UK. You've got processors and manufacturers, the wholesalers and retailers. You've got the caterers. You have consumers and citizens, and there's a difference. Consumers are defined by what they spend their money on. Citizens are defined by how they shape the society in which they live and shape the rules and what governments do. And one of the things we've seen is an enormous ability of many of the players in red to become the best lobbyists and setting up for the policymakers for government practices. And actually it's the groups in red over the last 20, 50 years, say, who've been competing for what one analyst called their percentage of the profit pie in the food system. Farmers get a very little amount of what is spent on the final amount of food. Next. So there is an issue, though. All of the actors have to deal with three basics. One is that our food system is a biological system. We require a healthy environment. I love Star Trek, and despite all the modern technology, the Star Trek replicator for producing food is a fiction. We need a healthy planet in which can maintain our food supplies for the next 5, 10, 100, 200, 500 years. And we know that we've, in different parts of the world, wrecked that. The Dust Bowl in the States and so on, as recently as the 30s. And in China today, you'll see great dust clouds coming across. Obviously, too, it's got a history. And it's a history that is of human expansion across the planet and of empires. European empires most recently, Roman empires 2,000 years ago. And it's a history that's also linked to slavery, as you well know from this city. Next. And the other thing, of course, is we all need food to eat. But I doubt any of you popped up this morning and had a bowl of carbohydrates with an element of protein and a few minerals. You ate foods. And we need foods, obviously, to keep our bodies going. But they're psychological, social, cultural. We express our shells, our friendship, our cultures through food. And when we talk about a city of culture, what is the culture that we demonstrate by the way we have our food? Now, what do the different groups use to try and control their bits of the action? Well, globally, and we are going to see this played out in the trade negotiations that go on, it's been political, military and economic power. That's what shaped the food system that we've got today. Nothing about what we eat in Britain today is kind of natural. You know, if you went back 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years and asked people what they ate in this particular place, you'd get very different answers. It's created and it's structured. We also use science and technology to develop new ways of doing things. But the question is, who decides what those ways are? Who's the power to control them and who's going to get the benefits from doing it? Next one, of course, is information. I guess many of you have little cards in your pockets from different supermarkets. These are customer profiling cards. And now with the internet, there are even better mechanisms for profiling you and trying to influence what you do with the finances that you have. Another area, of course, is how you manage things in your system, and often the biggest players structure, for example, their distribution systems to suit them, not necessarily keep the money in the local area or what have you. And finally, there, of course, are the rules and the laws and the regulations that decide what happens. These have progressively gone from local to regional to global. And in this, we've seen enormous power shifts over the last 50 to 60 years. Firstly, and the one you're most familiar with, I guess, is the fact that very few buying desks of supermarkets control most of the food that moves into consumption. If you look in the Netherlands, next slide, it's just 5. In the UK, it's 8, 9, but it's 4 or 5 who control most of the food that moves into consumption. And if you're a supplier to any of these, you'll know the power that they have. Next. But it's not just in the retail area. If you look at the basis of our food system, seeds, the chemical companies like Monsanto and Bayer and Dow and DuPont and Syngenta moved into the food business, the food production business, when you changed the rules on intellectual property and patents, and we had a system of just a few big companies. Those 6 big ones in red have now merged to 3. Syngenta's part of China Chem, Monsanto and Bayer are merging, and they're dropping the Monsanto name because of its toxic nature, and DuPont and Dow are merging in the States. So right away across that food system, if you look at the groups in red, it's fewer and fewer players control more and more of the action in any of those groups. So that's the system in which we are, and there's a lot of material that you can look at to help find more. Any of the things I'm putting up on here are accessible and downloadable on the internet, so they're free to access. Reports from the Agri-Food Atlas and the International Panel on Sustainable Food Systems, IPIS Food Report, very well worth having a look at. But the image I think we need to think about as Europeans is this only souvenir I brought back from going to Australia, which is an Australian map of the world. Do you notice something different about it? It's Pacific-centred. Can any of you see Britain? It's that little island way up there, kind of there. Even Europe's quite a small place. The geopolitics of the planet are changing in a massive way, which we do not understand the implications of yet. The Europeans and the European derivative powers like the States are on the way in shaping what happens in the food system. And that's what shaped the food system for the last 500 years. China, India and others. So we have a big changing world, and we don't want the kind of ways we've managed the food system using military and economic power to structure it, I think, for the next 500 years. Otherwise we're going to be in trouble. So looking at the big threats we face, food is linked to all of them, either directly or indirectly. You all know about climate destabilisation. Don't call it global warming, it sounds cosy, it ain't. It's destabilisation. Everything that we've assumed in the past isn't going to be like it was. The next one, of course, are increasing levels of inequality. And they are demonstrated so clearly through food, as our Commission on Food and Poverty found, because even where childhood obesity rates are declining in average in the UK, they're actually going worse for the poorest sections of the community. We also have competition over resources, energy, water, land, and so on. And finally, we have one of the biggest wastes in the world of our creative and skills by spending so much money and research on better ways of killing ourselves, rather than ways of figuring out how to live on this place in a better way. And food is always central. Just did an interview with Polly Russell from the British Library. I don't know if you saw her back in time for dinner and tea. You know, food is never, ever just food. It embodies things to do with the political structure and so on. Now, there are two different ways of thinking about the future of sustainability. One is, look, we're clever animals. We are clever human beings, and it doesn't really matter if we trash the planet, because we are going to come out of it and find technological fixes. We're the only things that matter. And this is often linked into what this report from the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research of the European Commission a few years ago produced. And they caricatured two different visions. Obviously, this is a caricature. But basically, it says it's only about production, and with technical fixes for all the problems. Economic growth just is a given. And demand just happens. It's what they call exogenous to the system. Well, demand does not just happen. Demand is created and directed and shaped. The other narrative they talk about is a sufficiency narrative. You know, enough is enough, that we need the biological and ecological health of the planet to be maintained. We need diversity, biodiversity. We need diversity in cultures and in expressions. And in food, we see that diversity globally. We can see that human communities across the planet have found ways of growing and sustaining themselves and coming up with fantastic cuisines, which in a multicultural society we are often very able to experience. You can go out and try the Thai or the Indian or all kinds of other foods. But knowledgeable small farmers able to use the best new science and technology as well as the indigenous knowledge are good for managing these ecological landscapes, and that equity matters in this system. You can't have a bit of the country or the planet which is really poor compared to the rest and expect a long-term stable system. And again, there's lots of reports that you can have a look at, give you ideas of what can be done and how you can build on that locally. This is another one from the International Panel on Food and